My name is Dan Royles. I'm an assistant professor in the history department, and I do a lot of work with oral history. I teach oral history in the history department, and it's also an important part of my research. So my research so far has focused on African American AIDS activism, and for that project or for that research, oral history has been a really important way to access histories that either haven't made it into archives yet or are underrepresented in archives, certainly underrepresented in public conversations about AIDS and AIDS activism. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to just hear a little bit about you. If we could do a quick round of introductions to help me know who I'm talking to, that'd be great. Let's start here.
Hello. My name's Alejandro Gonzalez. I am 22. I am a digital arts student. I'm currently interning with the Jewish Museum of Florida, and I'm having a blast. It's great.
Good.
All right, so.
Yeah, just pass it around.
Hello. I'm Christopher Montejo. I am a computer science and philosophy double major, and I'm currently interning with Stonewall, and I'm also having a blast. So.
Right, hi, I'm Sonia. I'm 22. I'm a senior. I'm studying international relations and French, and I'm working at Vizcaya, also having a blast. Yeah, that's it.
Great.
I'm Vincent Estasi. I'm an art history major, and I'm at the Museum of Graffiti.
Great.
Yes, I'm having a great time.
My name's Marin. I'm a linguistics major, and I'm starting at the World AIDS Museum next week.
Great. You'll have a blast.
I hope I will have a blast.
I'll just
Yeah.
you go ahead.
I'm Katie. I
Katie.
work with everybody because I'm the archivist at WPHL. We've met before,
Yeah.
I think. And you guys are in for a treat. I saw this presentation a few months ago, or one similar with Dan, and it's very informative, and I learned quite a bit.
Awesome. We had a blast.
And I had a blast.
All right, so let's dive into oral history with a little bit of a definition. As is the case with a lot of academic things, one thing that we like to talk a lot about is definitions. And so oral historians like to talk about kind of how we define our field. So this is one, I think, really good definition of what oral history is. And it's recording personal testimony in oral form for purposes beyond the interview itself. So I want to highlight a couple of elements of this definition. One is that it is recorded testimony, and that's really important. We are creating a document of someone's experience by talking to them, by eliciting orally from them stories about their life, stories about the aspects of their life that we are interested in. So it is important that that testimony comes to us orally. There's a lot of kind of thinking and theorizing and writing in the field of oral history about what it means to elicit and give and record specifically oral testimony, and how that differs from perhaps other kinds of documentation, written testimony, letters, diaries, things of that nature. And then this is done for purposes beyond the interview itself. So we do this as maybe a matter of our research or archive building. And this kind of ties back to the idea that this is recorded, right? We're creating a document that ideally will live in a library or an archive so that not only we can use it, but other people down the line can use it as well. One thing to keep in mind here is that if and when you go and do an oral history with somebody, especially if it's somebody who, has not had the opportunity to donate their papers or has not, been, reported on in the press, you might be creating the only kind of lasting document of that person's life that's going to be accessible to people later on. So there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with doing oral history as well. And part of the purpose of this workshop is to give you the tools to do it well, so that you can take that responsibility. So a little bit more fleshing out of this definition, or just what kind of oral history is. Generally, we're talking about pretty lengthy interviews. At least an hour is the guideline that I give to students when I teach oral history. I've had oral histories that go quite a bit longer than an hour. I had one that went 5 hours at a stretch, which was a very long time, and not kind of an outlier. But generally, when I do interviews, they go, I'd say 2 to 2.5 hours. So quite a bit of time. Remember that you're kind of capturing a significant chunk of somebody's life in oral testimony. So that kind of makes sense. When we talk about oral history, we generally are talking about life history interviewing. So, not just asking somebody about the specific parts or aspects of their life that we're interested in, but trying to get a sense of what somebody is like as a whole person, including the arc of their life and where what we're talking about fits into that. So, a lot of my interviewing has been around stories of activism, specifically AIDS activism, and usually that's something that people came to in their 20s or 30s. But I always start my interviews with, tell me about your early life, because I really want to know what it was kind of, back in childhood, in somebody's early community and their family life that led them to the path that they got on that brought them to intersect with my research, right? So having them do that for me, having them give me a sense of where they came from, and having them often explicitly draw those connections for me and for people down the line can be really, really interesting. So life history is an important aspect of this as well. Generally, when we're talking about oral history, we are talking about one-on-one interviewing. So I am like an interviewer. I am sitting down with the person that we call the narrator, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. But I'm sitting with them one-on-one, having a conversation, fully listening to and paying attention to what they have to say. The reason that I point this out is that sometimes people have the idea, and it's not a bad idea, of interviewing, say a husband and wife or a small group of people who are very active in a movement together. And certainly you can do that. It's something that you want to be deliberate about and conscious of, because whenever you bring a group of people, whether it's 2 people or 3 people or 4 people, into an interview setting, you bring in all of their interpersonal dynamics. And so that can get complicated, right? Like if you're interviewing, say, a husband and wife, or a parent and child, or 2 siblings, or 2 longtime best friends, you're probably bringing some kind of power dynamic, some kind of power imbalance into the interview. And that is probably going to shape what you get in terms of answers to questions. You might get, less candid answers to your questions than you might otherwise. So generally, we are talking about a one-on-one interview. But it is a very flexible research method. There's a lot of kind of different ways that you can, modulate different variables of this in order to make it fit your research needs. And then finally, again, because this is interviewing being done for purposes beyond the interview itself, we are talking about interviews that are archived or otherwise preserved. So starting out with a plan that this is going to go into the Jewish Museum or the World AIDS Museum, or is going to be kept at Stonewall or at FIU libraries, is going to be made accessible to researchers in the future in one way or another. So why do oral history? Why is this important? Well, one important reason is that it lets us capture the experiences of people whose voices would otherwise not be preserved in the historical record. So this is something that we think about when we are conceiving a project, when we're picking the people that we want to interview, is that archives are pretty good at preserving the stories of people who have some kind of power, whether that's political power, institutional power, social power. So people who are, white and male of European descent, tend to be overrepresented in archives. People who are not, don't align with those categories tend to be very underrepresented in archives. So it's a good way to kind of get a sense of people's experience who, just otherwise don't have their experience captured by the historical record. it's really a good method or an important method because in doing this kind of interviewing, we're giving agency to people whose stories are being recorded. So, by sitting down with somebody, by asking them questions, by creating the space for them to tell their story in a recorded way, you're giving somebody agency, giving somebody, a level of control over how their story is going to be shaped and preserved for the future. And I think there's something really valuable about that. It helps us to understand what can often be big kind of abstract phenomena or events, processes, things like immigration, gentrification, political change, revolution, helps us to understand what can be very big kind of abstract concepts at the level of people's individual experience, and maybe get a collection of those experiences to make a composite portrait of how individual people experience something that is, in its larger form, harder to represent. It helps us to understand the people that we talk to as kind of whole people. So, I know a lot of you are working in archives, and so, what you may find as you're going through a collection of documents, whatever they might be, you'll find little snippets of people, right? Like little documentary fragments. Somebody gets mentioned in a newspaper article or somebody writes a letter. You get these little glimpses into people's lives that are fragmentary, right? They're like little bits. Oral history lets you get a sense of somebody as an entire, fully fleshed out, whole human being. So it's something that we don't normally get out of archival materials, that oral history kind of is a unique contribution there. And then again, this is a flexible interdisciplinary research method, so one that you can use in lots of different ways, in different settings, all kinds of aspects of this that you can modulate to fit your research needs. So I'd like to take a couple minutes right now to just kind of brainstorm or spitball how you might use this in your own research. So when you're working with your community partners, with Stonewall, with World AIDS Museum, with Graffiti Museum, with Vizcaya, like how might this come into the work that you either are doing there or might think about doing there? So this can be like, kind of theoretical or hypothetical in the future as well. Yeah, go ahead.
You can just speak into this.
Yeah, so my research at Vizcaya is really centered around writing a land acknowledgement statement and giving a voice to indigenous communities in Florida. But what I found is that the communities that were in the land that Vizcaya is on were largely moved to Oklahoma. So I think it would be interesting to maybe reach out to those tribes and conduct oral histories to get whatever history they have from the tribe, and then also just personally how they were affected by the move, and if they still feel they have any connection to this land. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with Stonewall, we have a lot of underrepresented voices, not only LGBTQ, but also Black, Hispanic, and so there's a lot of underrepresented history there that I feel like oral history and being able to capture and share it would be really valuable, and to where the space before has been dominated by other voices. With this, it kind of gives me an opportunity.
Yeah. Great.
All right, I guess I'll just talk too. Well, my experience working with the Jewish Museum has mostly been what you are referring to, those fragments of people that you find that in itself, they're these little pieces that don't tell you the whole story, and they're often hard to place historically and regarding their context. And as far as I'm able to understand based on what I'm being exposed to, oral histories are a great way to get a sense of context and what people were going through and how they're taking it, and how all these macrocosms are affecting them and how they fit within it, which is something that newspaper clippings and photographs do not give you. So it helps things make it makes them less abstract.
Yeah.
Certainly.
You could just toss it, try tossing it.
Really? No, I wouldn't do that.
Thank you. I feel I could use it in like you said, an unbiased way, not only personal, because I guess the stigma of graffiti is usually gang related. But I could try to expose the flaws in posing it as that, also at the same time, unbiasedly showing the ugly side of I guess the good and the bad, to give an unbiased conclusion, and then I guess since it's in an archive, wouldn't the curator choose to, depending on what exhibition or what the concept of a show would be, to choose what side they want to use? Because at the museum there is like a police section, but there's also like a collection of art that is based off of graffiti, you know, Keith Haring or Basquiat.
Yeah.
So I guess unbiasedly I would use it to teach people, and they can draw their own opinion from it.
I mean, one of the things that we try to do with oral history is to give context. As you said, oral history is really good for that, but also to give people like more kind of complicated, nuanced understandings of what we're talking about. So, you know, people might think about graffiti in this like very kind of like binary way, like it's high art or it's crime. And, you know, what you may find in interviewing people, especially people who are like graffiti artists, is that, you know, they might bring a kind of more nuanced lens onto the work that they do. And so, you know, the value of oral history then is like helping people to kind of see, you know, this visual form in a kind of more complicated, complex way. I really liked what you said about, you know, the curator can use this in different ways, right? Which is absolutely true. And, you know, you can think about, you know, the interview that you do, and so you end up with a recording and probably a transcript. You know, you can do a lot of stuff down the line with that recording. You can, or the institution can, in terms of, you know, clipping stuff out for documentaries or for podcasts or for exhibitions. You know, there's all kinds of like ways that the interview can live in different formats later on. And what we're doing in doing the recording is allowing for that to happen, right? Like we're making that future work possible by interviewing people now. Let's see. Other things that you might think about, and I really particularly thought about this with the land acknowledgement, is like, you know, you can think about this in terms of doing your own interviews. You can also think about looking for what interviews already exist. Like what work have people already done that you might be able to take and then build on, you know, into a land acknowledgement or an exhibit or something else. You know, so also think about how you can find what already exists in the world in terms of this work. And hi. I feel like there was one other thing that I wanted to pull out, but maybe not. You know, one kind of significant area where there's been a lot of oral history work done is in Holocaust remembrance. You know, so something that's very much of interest to the Jewish Museum. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, my name is Monica. I work at the Historic Boarding Room.
Where?
The Historic Boarding Room.
Where's that?
The Ward Rooming House.
Ward Rooming House. Okay. It's okay. I'm Dan Royles. I'm leading this workshop. So we're just talking about a little bit about what oral history is, kind of the components of it, and then we're brainstorming, you know, how this might come into the work that you're doing for the Miami Studies program. So we'll get into a little bit of kind of technical aspects of what this looks like in practice. And so here I think it's really valuable to think about interviews being part of a kind of like life cycle. If you want to do the like, I don't know, like elementary school biology, like the butterfly is an egg, and then it's a chrysalis. Like, just think about that kind of like wheel of nature here, but with interviews. So, before you do anything, you want to think about kind of what's the framing of your project. What are your goals? What do you want to find out? What are your working questions? Do you have kind of working ideas about what it is that you're going to find? And then based on that initial framing, you're going to think about who is it that I want to interview? And you're going to start reaching out to those people. And so this can come from the archive. You might be working in a collection and say, I don't know, I'm working in the ACT UP Fort Lauderdale collection. And, I know that these people get mentioned. I want to see if these people are still living and see if I can get in touch with them. And so that might be a way that you identify an initial list of narrators. I said I was going to explain why I say narrators, and I'll do that now. This goes back to the question of agency and control. Because we use the term narrators to, instead of something like interviewee, which is kind of like you have an action being done on you, I am being interviewed. Instead, we say narrators because like I am doing an action. I am narrating my life experience. So it's one of the ways that we represent that sense of agency that we're trying to always devolve to the narrators that we are interviewing. So you might generate an initial list from your archival research, and then those people, when you contact them, might tell you other people to contact as well. So you can use the kind of snowball sampling, or what we call snowball sampling method, to start from an initial list and then build on that to find more people to interview. You're going to do a pre-interview where you meet with the narrator for maybe 15, 20 minutes and just explain what the process is going to look like. That's a good opportunity for you to answer questions, but also to start to build a rapport with them, to build a kind of connection, a familiarity, a relationship that's going to pay off when you actually sit down to interview them about their life. If they feel comfortable with you, that interview is going to be much more productive than if you're talking to them for the first time. So this is a good opportunity to explain what the process is going to look like, explain what kind of rights they have, what kind of control they have over the interview. And I'll talk about in a minute, we give them quite a bit of control over the interview process. Then you sit down and you do the recorded interview. Again, this should be an hour or more. So you're sitting down, you have your questions, and you are having a conversation with this person about their life. Then you're going to transcribe that interview, either do it yourself or have somebody else do it. Probably do it yourself because it's kind of expensive. We're not to the point where computers can do this really well for us, at least in like a way that is kind of commercially widely available. But transcribing your interview, which means like typing out basically, a script of it, is a good way to get to know your interview material really well. Like you'll have a pretty intimate knowledge of it once you've listened to it and written it all out. Then we take that transcript, that script of the interview, and return it to the narrator. The reason that we do this is because, again, we want to devolve as much control, as much power in the interview process to the narrator as we can at every stage that we can. And this goes back to the idea of that this is a method that gives a lot of agency to the people whose stories we're capturing. You, especially being student interns on a bigger project, might not feel like you have a lot of kind of power or like seniority here, but by virtue of kind of being agents of the university, agents of the Wolfson Public Humanities Lab, Wolfsonian, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, you have a lot of institutional power behind you. And so one of the things that we want to do as oral historians is take that power and devolve it, to transfer it to the people whose stories we're working to capture. Because often this means working with people who are historically and socially marginalized in one or more ways. And so it's important from an ethical perspective for us to do this as much as we can. So we take that transcript and we give it back to the narrator and say, you read through this, you take out anything that you don't want to be a matter of public record, for any reason. personal, professional, whatever. Because I talked about my sister-in-law and I want her to be able to see what I said about her, whatever. We give them the opportunity and the control over the transcript in that way. Very often people will say, yeah, this looks good, perfect, fine, put it in the archive, and that's great. But it is important that we have that layer of protection for the narrators to determine how they want to be protected. So after they've seen it, after they've read it, they will edit or redact or seal any portion of it that they want to, and then sign off on it. And then at that point, the transcript in whatever form that it is will go into the archive along with a recording of the interview and be made available to the public under whatever terms the narrator has sent. Again, in my experience, generally narrators are they look at it and say, cool, fine, make it available, whatever. But it is important that we give them the opportunity to exercise control over what is their life story, right? I mean, that's the important thing to keep in mind here, is that by virtue of doing oral history, you're becoming the custodian or the steward or the channel by which somebody's story gets recorded and made available. And so it's always just good to keep that in mind so that you can kind of keep the ethical imperatives of that front of mind as well. Hi, I'm Dan Royles. I'm leading this workshop. Can you introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, my name is Dominique St. Victor. I'm in the master's program doing the public history track.
Great. Welcome.
Yeah.
So some of the ways that we protect narrators in this way, we use forms before and after the interview to do a couple things. One, before the interview, is to communicate to the narrator what their rights are in the context of the interview. Remember, you're representing a powerful institution when you do interviewing as an agent of FIU. And so we want to make sure that narrators understand that they can do things like refuse to answer questions, stop the interview at any time. One thing that I always write into my forms is if we get to the end of the interview and you decide, I don't want any of that to be public record, I will destroy the interview. Destroy the record, it will never be transcribed. That's never happened in all the interviewing that I've done, but it's important to have that as a kind of outlet or an option, a fail-safe for narrators, to feel comfortable, just to feel comfortable, and to have that in order to fully protect them or protect them as much as possible. So we use the consent form before the interview. And again, that's something that you can go over during the pre-interview and answer any questions that they have. And then we use a deed of gift after the interview that clarifies, hey, these are your rights to the material, these are my rights to the material. And basically, it's you retain a non-exclusive copyright to the interview. That makes sense. It's your life story. It wouldn't make sense for me to take that right away from you. But I, as the interviewer, have a right to it as well. And so that's what allows you to then take a body of interviews and transfer them to a library or archive. And it's important for the library or archive often to have that documentation so that they feel comfortable making it accessible to the public. So again, what we're trying to do with these forms, with the way that we approach the interview setting, with every kind of stage of this process, is to take the power that we have as interviewers and devolve it to the people that we are interviewing, our narrators. It's really important to understand, however, what you can promise and what you cannot. You cannot promise somebody full anonymity, and you cannot promise them legal protection. So there's one very famous case in which this came to the fore, and that was a case that involved Boston College, where they had somebody who was doing interviews with people who had been active in at the time called the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So this is a period of very intense, bloody political conflict between Irish nationalists and English loyalists. And so this was in the 70s and 80s. This is a period in which people were assassinated, had their homes or cars blown up, where people were murdered for political reasons. And so, after the Good Friday Accords in the 90s, the end of this violence, there was an interest in going in and talking to people who had been active perpetrators of that. And we can probably see why that would be interesting to people, why we just, as people who want to know more, would want to do that. The problem is that the person who was doing the interviewing told the people that they were interviewing, told their narrators, hey, we'll shield this material from any kind of public view or from any kind of access until, you die, so that you won't be exposed to legal liability for the things that you're telling us. Well, they had no authority to actually promise that. And so that material was subpoenaed successfully by the US government, and maybe it was the US government. It was subpoenaed successfully by some government. It might have been the British government. But the point is that, they promised more than they could deliver and put their narrators at risk as a result. Obviously, we don't want to do this. So it's just important to understand that you can promise somebody confidentiality, not to use their real name. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But you cannot promise somebody full anonymity. They're giving you, by nature of doing the interview, personally identifiable information, whether or not they use their name. And so, again, thinking ethically about how we do this kind of work, you want to be attuned to when somebody is telling you information that might put them at legal risk. So just keep that in mind. Again, not something that I expect is going to come up in, in a lot, or even if any of your work, but it is important to understand what you can promise and what you cannot. So again, some things to know. Consent can be given on camera. So I talked in the last slide about using a consent form in order to communicate somebody's rights and to have them, acknowledge that they understand those. You can also do this on camera. You're not always going to be interviewing people who have a high level of literacy or have a high enough level of literacy to, complete a consent form. And that's fine. It's one of the strengths of oral history is that we can capture a wider range of voices than a printed archive can. So it is fine for somebody to give consent on camera, for you to read through the consent form and them to say, I consent. Narrators can choose a pseudonym or a false name for themselves. This is fine. And if they're doing this, this is another instance in which you might want to use verbal consent on camera rather than a printed form. So you just want to ask them, what do you want your pseudonym to be? And I'll use that pseudonym for you. But again, anonymity is not something that you can promise because by the very nature of the interviewing, they are giving you personally identifiable information that can be used to identify them later on. So again, we can promise confidentiality, but we cannot promise full anonymity. Anonymity meaning that nobody will be able to find out who you are. They probably will, at least to some degree. And so the deed of gift form that I mentioned in the last slide or 2 slides ago is one where the narrator can place any kind of restrictions on access that they want. So say they're I don't want anybody to see this for 5 years or 10 years or until I retire or until after I die. They can put that stipulation on the deed of gift form, and when it gets transferred to a library or archive, the library or archive will respect that and say, okay, we're going to hold this, we're going to seal this until such and such a date, in accordance with their wishes. So, some steps to a successful interview. Ask clear and appropriate questions. This is probably harder than it sounds because often, especially when you start out interviewing, you're going to be nervous. And you're probably going to ask a question that is fully a minute long and has 3 different questions within it. You don't want to do that. You want to ask one clear question at a time. So it's really good ahead of time to write out an interview guide, a list of questions that you want to ask. Doesn't mean that you go through that list of questions robotically, like you're doing a survey. You want to have an intimate conversation with somebody, right? You want to show that you are listening. You want to respond to what they're telling you. And so, that means being flexible, being responsive to what they're saying, but also making sure, that you hit all the points that you want to hit. So having your questions written out ahead of time really helps along these lines for you to ask those questions that you know are going to be clearly worded. By appropriate, if you have a really good rapport established with a narrator where you feel like you can ask them more personal questions, or if they open up that space for you to ask them about more personal aspects of their life, go ahead and do so. But read the room, read what their energy is, what they seem willing to talk about, what they don't. They can always decline to answer a question, but you just want to be kind of sensitive in the interview context to what they seem open to. It's important to listen to the narrator. That might seem obvious, but again, it can be easy if you have your interview guide written out to just go through those questions because it's a thing that you have to fall back on. Really good interviewers, though, will make the narrator forget that they're being interviewed. Will make it feel more like a conversation. That doesn't mean that you spend a lot of time talking. Actually, you should spend probably 95% or more of the time listening to the other person. Because we're not here to record your story. We're here to record their story, right? And so it's all about kind of learning to ask those good, open-ended questions that get somebody talking and keeps them talking. And then when they stop talking, I use a rule that I also use in teaching, which is when you ask a question, wait like 7 seconds before you follow up. Because when we're asking a question, right? So I ask you a question, you have to hear the question, process the question in your brain, formulate a response, and then articulate that response. And that's actually kind of a lengthy process. But we, whether as part of human nature or social conditioning, I'm not sure, whatever, we don't like to hear silence, right? It kind of makes you nervous. You want to fill that silence with another question or some more talking because you're nervous, and that's fine. So, after asking a question, you might count in your head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 before following up. And same thing when somebody gets to what sounds like the end of a story. I leave some dead space there because they might be hesitating or whatever, or something just might be kind of churning in their brain that comes out and then is really interesting. And if you step on that by talking, you might miss something that you'll never know that you missed. So listen to the narrator and don't be afraid of that dead air. It takes nothing away from you. It might make you a little nervous, but it takes nothing away from you. And it might actually lead you to some really good nugget of information or a fantastic story that is going to make your research so much richer. Again, it's very important that we give narrators the space to talk and recollect freely. Sometimes people will ask, what if they go off topic? And the general response is, there is no off topic. You're collecting somebody's life history. You don't really get to decide what is on and off topic. It may be more or less interesting to you, but it's clearly interesting to them. And very possibly, it'll be interesting to somebody else who might access the interview later. So again, devolving power in the interview context, this is another way that we do it. By putting narrators in the driver's seat, we are creating the space for them to talk and recollect. We are not directing the conversation in any other way than asking good open-ended questions. And then when they have given a very long response, ask them good follow-up questions. That's another way that you show that you are listening and engaged is by asking them about what they just told you rather than necessarily moving on to the next question in your interview guide. So again, pay attention to nonverbal cues. This can be signs of discomfort, signs of being tired, especially with older narrators. You want to pay attention to kind of what somebody's energy level is like to make sure that you're not overtaxing them. You can always split an interview up across multiple days if you have to, but just pay attention to kind of where people are at in the interview context, whether that means anxiety, discomfort, tiredness, whatever, be attuned to what's going on with them as much as you can. And then again, ask good follow-up questions. This is really a skill that I think you develop over time. I hope that I'm better at it now than I was when I started doing interviews. But it's something that you want to keep in mind, but also something that you will get better at the more interviewing that you do. Some quick tips for recording. Test your equipment beforehand. Make sure you know how to use it. Do a short dry run so that you know how your mic works, how your camera works, how they work together, what kind of settings you need to have. You want to find a quiet space where the narrator is comfortable. So I always warn people against interviewing outside. I would not interview anybody in a coffee shop. I would not interview anybody in a restaurant or a bar, anywhere that you have a lot of background noise going on. I would just say that in general. If there's a situation where that's really important or appropriate to your project, then obviously that could change. But you want to think about the quality of the recording, not only for people down the line, but just so that you can actually listen to it and transcribe it after the recording is done. When I'm talking about interviewing people, generally it's like they have a lavalier mic, or I use mostly lavalier mics. I think a lot of people use lavalier mics or lapel mics. So if you're doing that, you want to watch out for jewelry and clothing like scarves. And you want to monitor your sound. So like if you're using a video camera to record, there's always a headphone jack. Have a pair of headphones, plug them in, keep them in during the interview so you can listen to the audio that's actually going into your recording device. And that's where you'll pick up a battery dying, a mic that's malfunctioning, or a problem like this, that you have a necklace that's like making a lot of noise, or a scarf that's like rubbing against the mic. It's going to make for a bad recording. Monitor your sound with headphones, and then be aware of harsh lighting or changing light. I'll confess, lighting is something that I still really struggle with. I would not, certainly don't see anybody in front of a bright window, which I've done. I generally recommend against using like just natural light in an interview. I had one interview that went so long that it went like 5 hours, and the sun like pretty much set like during the interview. So by the end of the interview, the guy had like Venetian blind like stripes going across his chest because the sun was coming in through the window and creating that shadow across him. But I didn't want to stop him because he was like really on a roll. So just think about your lighting. Try to light people in a way that is flattering to them. And this is assuming, of course, that you're doing video recording. If you're doing only audio recording, you don't have to think about light, aside from maybe being able to see the other person.
This was so great. Thank you so much.